The morning of Lady Isabella Hartley's wedding dawned bright and beautiful with golden sunlight streaming through the windows of Hartley Manor. She stood before the mirror in her bridal gown, watching as her maid adjusted the delicate lace veil that had been worn by generations of Hartley brides. The dress was perfect, ivory silk embroidered with tiny pearls that caught the light with every movement. She should have felt happy. She should have felt excited. Instead, she felt nothing but a hollow emptiness in her chest. Today she would marry Lord Edmund Rothbury, a man she had known for barely 3 months, a man her father had chosen for her, a man who smiled at all the right moments and said all the right things, but whose eyes remained cold and calculating no matter how charming his words. "You look beautiful, my lady," her maid Sarah said softly. "Lord Rothbury is a fortunate man." Isabella forced a smile. "Thank you, Sarah." But as she looked at her reflection, she could not help but think of another man. A man she had rejected 6 months ago. A man whose proposal she had refused with words that still haunted her in the quiet moments before sleep. Duke Alexander Blackwell had asked for her hand in the spring. He was wealthy beyond measure, handsome in a way that made women whisper behind their fans, respected throughout the kingdom for his intelligence and honor. Her father had been thrilled at the prospect of such a match, but Isabella had said no. She had her reasons. Duke Blackwell was known for his serious nature, his stern demeanor, his lack of interest in the social pleasantries that filled the lives of the nobility. He rarely smiled. He never danced, unless absolutely required. He spent his time managing his estates and working on reforms for the poor rather than attending parties and balls. Isabella had been young and foolish. She had wanted romance and passion and excitement. She had wanted a man who would sweep her off her feet with grand gestures and flowery words. Duke Blackwell had offered her respect and partnership and a life of purpose, but she had been too blind to see the value in what he offered. So she had refused him, politely but firmly. She had told him that they would not suit, that she needed someone more aligned with her temperament, someone more sociable and light-hearted. He had accepted her refusal with perfect dignity. He had bowed and thanked her for her honesty and wished her well. But then he had left, and she had not seen him since. 3 months later, Lord Edmund Rothbury had appeared in her life, charming and attentive, and everything she thought she wanted. He had courted her with flowers and poetry and declarations of devotion. Her father had approved the match. The wedding had been arranged with impressive speed. And now, here she stood on her wedding day, feeling like she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. "My lady, the carriages are ready," Sarah said, interrupting her thoughts. "Your father is waiting." Isabella took a deep breath and turned from the mirror. There was no point in second-guessing now. The decision had been made. The guests were waiting at the church. She would marry Lord Rothbury, and hopefully in time she would come to care for him. She descended the grand staircase, where her father waited at the bottom. Lord Hartley was a large man with graying hair and a stern expression that rarely softened. But when he saw his daughter in her wedding gown, his eyes grew misty. "You are the image of your mother," he said gruffly. She would have been proud. Isabella's mother had died when she was 10. The loss still ached like a wound that never fully healed. "Thank you, Papa." He offered his arm and led her outside where the wedding carriage waited. It was decorated with white roses and ribbons. The horses wore plumes of white feathers. Everything was perfect and beautiful, and exactly as a wedding should be. Isabella climbed into the carriage with her father settling into the seat across from her. The driver called to the horses, and they began the journey to the church where Lord Rothbury waited. The road to the church led through the forest that bordered the Hartley estate. Ancient trees formed a canopy overhead, filtering the sunlight into patterns of gold and green. It was beautiful and peaceful, and Isabella found herself wishing the journey could last forever, that she could remain in this moment, suspended between one life and another. They were halfway through the forest when the carriage suddenly lurched to a violent stop. Isabella was thrown forward, catching herself against the seat. Her father cursed and reached for the door. "What is the meaning of this?" he shouted to the driver. The answer came not from the driver, but from a voice outside the carriage, a voice that was rough and cruel and sent ice through Isabella's veins. "Step out of the carriage, Lord Hartley, nice and slow, and perhaps we will let you live." Isabella's father went rigid. He looked at her with fear in his eyes, fear she had never seen before. "Stay behind me," he ordered. He opened the carriage door and stepped out. Isabella followed despite his command, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. 5 men on horseback surrounded the carriage. They wore dark clothes and masks that covered the lower half of their faces. Each man held a pistol pointed at the carriage. The driver lay slumped in his seat. Isabella could not tell if he was unconscious or dead. "What do you want?" Lord Hartley demanded. "I have money, jewels. Take what you want and let us pass." The leader of the group laughed, and he was a large man with cold eyes visible above his mask. "We don't want your money, old man. We want the bride." Isabella felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "No," her father said, stepping in front of her. "You cannot have her. I will not allow it." "You have no choice in the matter," the leader said. He gestured to 2 of his men. "Take her." The men dismounted and moved toward the carriage. Lord Hartley tried to stop them, but one of the men struck him across the face with the butt of his pistol. He fell to the ground, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. "Papa!" Isabella screamed. She tried to run to him, but rough hands grabbed her arms. She fought with everything she had, kicking and clawing and screaming for help. But her captors were strong, and her wedding gown restricted her movements. They dragged her toward one of the horses, ignoring her struggles. "Let me go," she cried. "Please let me go." "Quiet, girl," the leader growled. "You will come with us, or your father dies right here. The choice is yours." Isabella looked at her father, who was trying to push himself up from the ground. Blood covered half his face. He looked old and helpless, and she knew the men would kill him without hesitation if she continued to resist. She stopped fighting. "I will come. Just please, do not hurt him." "Wise choice," the leader said. They lifted her onto a horse, and one of the men climbed up behind her, holding her firmly around the waist. The other men mounted their horses. The leader looked down at Lord Hartley, who was now on his knees, staring up at them with anguish in his eyes. "Now tell Lord Rothbury that if he wants his bride back, he will pay £50,000. We will send word of where to deliver the ransom. If he refuses, or if anyone attempts to follow us, the girl dies. Do you understand?" Lord Hartley nodded, unable to speak. The leader kicked his horse into motion, and the group thundered into the forest, with Isabella held captive among them. She looked back over her shoulder, watching her father grow smaller and smaller until the trees blocked him from view. Tears streamed down her face. Her beautiful wedding dress was already torn and dirty. Her veil had been ripped away in the struggle. Everything had happened so fast, she could barely comprehend it. They rode for what felt like hours, though it was probably less. The men did not speak except to give occasional directions. They took paths through the densest parts of the forest, where the trees grew so thick that even the midday sun barely penetrated. Isabella tried to memorize the route, but everything looked the same, and her panic made it impossible to think clearly. Finally, they emerged into a clearing where an old, abandoned hunting lodge stood. The building was falling apart with broken windows and a sagging roof. It looked like it had not been used in years. The men dismounted and pulled Isabella from the horse. Her legs were shaking so badly she could barely stand. They dragged her into the lodge and down a narrow staircase into what must have been a cellar. The room was dark and damp with stone walls and a dirt floor. The only light came from a small window near the ceiling that was barred with iron. They pushed her into the corner, and the leader crouched down to look at her. "Stay quiet, and do as you are told, and you might survive this. Give us trouble, and you will regret it. Understood?" Isabella nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He stood, and the men left the cellar. She heard the sound of a heavy bolt sliding into place, then footsteps above her head, voices, talking and laughing as if this was all just an ordinary day. Isabella wrapped her arms around herself and began to cry. Great shaking sobs that tore from her chest. She cried for her father, who must be frantic with worry. She cried for the wedding that would never happen. She cried for her own foolishness in not seeing the danger that surrounded her. But most of all, she cried because she knew with terrible certainty that Lord Rothbury would not pay the ransom. He had courted her for her father's wealth and connections, not for love. He would not risk £50,000 for a bride he barely knew, which meant she was going to die in this dark, cold cellar, alone and afraid, and regretting every choice that had brought her to this moment. Hours passed. The light from the small window faded as evening approached. Isabella's tears eventually dried, leaving her empty and numb. She could hear the men moving around upstairs, smell food cooking that made her stomach clench with hunger despite her fear. Night fell, and the cellar became completely dark. Isabella huddled in the corner trying to keep warm. Her wedding dress provided little protection against the cold. She dozed fitfully, waking at every sound, terrified that the men were coming back. It was deep in the night when she heard something that made her freeze, the sound of horses approaching, many horses, voices shouting, then gunfire. The sounds of a fight erupted above her, men yelling, furniture crashing, more gunshots. Isabella pressed herself against the wall, her heart racing. Were these more criminals? Had someone found her? Was this rescue or something worse? The fighting seemed to last forever, but was probably only minutes. Then sudden silence. Footsteps on the stairs. The sound of the bolt being drawn back. The door opened, and a figure appeared silhouetted against the lamplight from the room beyond. A tall man in dark clothes, holding a pistol. For a moment, Isabella could not see his face, and terror froze her in place. Then he stepped into the cellar and raised the lamp he carried in his other hand. The light fell across his face, and Isabella's breath caught in her throat. It was Duke Alexander Blackwell, the man she had rejected, the man she had not seen in 6 months. He stood before her covered in dust and looking grim and dangerous and more handsome than she remembered. Their eyes met across the dark cellar, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then he crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides and knelt beside her. "Lady Isabella," he said. His voice was rough with emotion. "Are you hurt? Did they harm you?" She shook her head, unable to find words. He was here. He had come for her. Despite her rejection, despite everything he had come. "Can you stand?" he asked. She nodded, and he helped her to her feet. Her legs were weak and she swayed. Without hesitation, he swept her up into his arms, holding her against his chest, as if she weighed nothing. "I have you," he said softly. "You are safe now. I promise you are safe." And as he carried her up the stairs and out of that terrible dark cellar, Isabella began to cry again. But this time, her tears were not from fear or despair. They were from relief and gratitude, and something else. Something that felt dangerously like hope. Part 2. The Duke's Confession. Duke Alexander carried Isabella out of the hunting lodge into the cool night air, where his men were securing the last of the kidnappers. She could see bodies lying motionless on the ground. Some of the Duke's soldiers were binding the hands of the surviving criminals, who glared at them with hatred and fear. The leader of the group who had threatened her father was on his knees, with blood running from a wound on his shoulder. "Take them to the magistrate," Duke Alexander ordered his captain. "Make sure they face justice for what they have done." "Yes, your grace," the captain replied. Then his eyes fell on Isabella, and his expression softened. "Is Lady Isabella unharmed?" "She appears to be, but we need to get her somewhere warm and safe." The Duke looked down at her, still cradled in his arms. "Can you ride? Or shall I arrange for a carriage?" "I can ride," Isabella said, though her voice shook. "Please, I just want to leave this place." He nodded and carried her to where the horses waited. His own mount was a massive black stallion that tossed its head impatiently. With surprising gentleness, he lifted Isabella onto the saddle, then swung up behind her. He wrapped his cloak around her shivering form and gathered the reins. "Hold on to me," he said quietly. She leaned back against his chest and felt his arm tighten around her waist. Then they were moving through the forest at a steady pace. The Duke's men followed behind them, forming a protective circle around their lord and his rescued captive. Isabella's mind was spinning with questions. How had he known where to find her? Why had he come? What happened to her father and Lord Rothbury? But she was too exhausted and overwhelmed to ask. Instead, she let herself relax against the Duke's solid warmth and focused on the rhythm of the horse's hooves. They rode for perhaps an hour before emerging from the forest. In the distance, Isabella could see the lights of a great house blazing against the night sky. Blackwell Hall, the Duke's ancestral estate. "I'm taking you to my home," Duke Alexander said, as if reading her thoughts. "Your father has been notified that you are safe. He wanted to come himself, but his injury required attention. The physician assured me it was not serious, but he needed rest." Relief flooded through Isabella. "Thank you for telling me. I was so worried." He was frantic when he came to me. He rode straight from the attack to Blackwell Hall and demanded I help find you. Isabella twisted to look up at him in surprise. "He came to you? But why? Why not go to Lord Rothbury?" Something dark flickered across the Duke's face. "He did go to Rothbury first. Your intended refused to pay the ransom. He claimed £50,000 was too high a price and suggested your father negotiate a lower amount." The words hit Isabella like a physical blow. She had suspected Lord Rothbury would not pay, but hearing it, confirmed, still hurt. "I see. When your father told me what happened, I gathered my men immediately. I've been tracking criminal activity in these woods for months. I knew the places they might take you." His arm tightened around her. "I'm only sorry I did not arrive sooner, that you had to endure even a moment of fear." "You saved my life," Isabella whispered. "How can I ever thank you? You owe me no thanks. I would have moved heaven and earth to find you." There was something in his voice that made her heart skip. She wanted to ask what he meant, but they had arrived at Blackwell Hall. Servants rushed out to greet them with worried faces and warm blankets. The Duke dismounted and lifted Isabella down. A woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper, took charge immediately. "Poor dear, you must be frozen and terrified. Come, let us get you warm and fed and into proper clothing." Isabella allowed herself to be led inside, but she looked back over her shoulder at Duke Alexander. He stood watching her with an expression she could not read. Then he turned to speak with his captain, and she was ushered up the grand staircase. Mrs. Davies brought her to a beautiful guest chamber where a fire already blazed in the hearth. Maids appeared with hot water and fresh clothes. They helped Isabella out of her ruined wedding dress and into a warm nightgown and robe. Someone brought tea and bread with butter. Isabella ate mechanically, barely tasting the food. When she was finally alone, she sank into the chair by the fire and tried to make sense of everything that had happened. This morning, she had been preparing to marry Lord Rothbury. Now her betrothed had abandoned her to kidnappers, and she was in the home of the man she had rejected, sitting in borrowed clothes and trying not to fall apart completely. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Duke Alexander entered carrying a tray with more tea and what looked like brandy. He had changed out of his riding clothes into a simple shirt and trousers. His dark hair was damp, as if he had just bathed. He looked younger somehow, less intimidating. "I thought you might need this," he said, offering her a glass of brandy. Isabella took it gratefully and sipped. The liquid burned going down, but warmth spread through her chest. "Thank you for everything. I do not know what would have happened if you had not come." He sat in the chair across from her, his expression grave. "I prefer not to think about it." Silence fell between them. Isabella studied his face in the firelight, the strong jaw, the serious gray eyes, the mouth that rarely smiled but was beautifully shaped nonetheless. How had she ever thought him stern and uninteresting? How had she been so blind? "Why did you come for me?" she asked quietly. "After I rejected your proposal. After I told you we would not suit. You had every reason to refuse when my father asked for help." Duke Alexander looked into the fire for a long moment before answering. "See, I came because despite your rejection, despite the fact that you chose another man, I never stopped caring for you, Isabella. When your father told me you were in danger, nothing else mattered. Not pride, not hurt feelings, only getting you back safely." Her breath caught at the raw honesty in his voice. "Alexander, I made a terrible mistake when I refused you. I was young and foolish, and I wanted things that don't matter. I did not see what was right in front of me. You wanted romance and passion," he said. "I could not offer you those things. I am not a man given to flowery words or grand gestures. I deal in facts and actions, not poetry." "You are wrong," Isabella said, setting down her glass. "You rode into danger to save me. You risked your life without hesitation. What could be more romantic than that? What words could ever compare to such actions?" He turned to look at her, and she saw surprise in his eyes. "Isabella, I have been so foolish," she continued. "I thought Lord Rothbury's pretty words and charming smiles meant something. But when I needed him most, he abandoned me. You never made me false promises, but you gave me something far more valuable. You gave me your loyalty and protection even when I had no claim to either." "You will always have my protection," he said quietly. "Whether you want it or not." Isabella stood and moved to kneel beside his chair. She took his hand in both of hers. "What if I want more than protection? What if I want the chance you offered me 6 months ago? The chance I was too blind to accept?" His eyes searched her face. "You have been through a terrible ordeal. You are not thinking clearly. Tomorrow, you may feel differently." "Tomorrow, I will feel the same," she said firmly. "I know my own heart, Alexander. And my heart is telling me that I belong here with you. If you will still have me." For the first time since she had known him, Duke Alexander Blackwell smiled. A real smile that transformed his entire face and made her heart soar. "I will always want you, Isabella. From the moment I first saw you, I knew you were the only woman I would ever love." He pulled her up and into his arms. His kiss was gentle at first, almost hesitant. But when she responded, wrapping her arms around his neck, the kiss deepened. It was everything she had ever wanted. Passion and tenderness and a promise of forever. When they finally broke apart, Both were breathing hard. "Marry me," he said. "Not because you have no other choice, but because you want to. Because you love me as I love you." "Yes," Isabella whispered. "Yes, to everything." Part 3. A love worth waiting for. The scandal that followed Isabella's failed wedding to Lord Rothbury swept through society like wildfire. Lord Rothbury's refusal to pay the ransom became public knowledge, and his reputation was destroyed overnight. The nobility who had once courted his favor now shunned him completely. He left the capital in disgrace and was never seen in polite society again. Isabella's father, Lord Hartley, recovered from his injury within days. When he learned that Duke Alexander had proposed again, and that Isabella had accepted, he wept with joy and relief. "I should have insisted on this match from the beginning," he told his daughter. "Blackwell is 10 times the man Rothbury ever was." The wedding took place 1 month later in the chapel at Blackwell Hall. It was a small, intimate ceremony, attended only by family and close friends. Isabella wore a gown of cream silk, far simpler than her first wedding dress, but infinitely more beautiful because she wore it with genuine happiness in her heart. Duke Alexander stood waiting for her at the altar, and when she walked down the aisle, his face lit with such love that several guests wiped tears from their eyes. This time, when they spoke, their vows, the words carried the weight of real commitment and deep affection. The kiss that sealed their union was tender and full of promise. When they turned to face their guests as husband and wife, the applause was thunderous. The wedding breakfast was filled with laughter and joy. But Isabella's father gave a speech praising Duke Alexander for his courage and honor. The Duke's closest friend toasted the couple and predicted a long and happy marriage. Isabella felt like her heart might burst from the sheer happiness of it all. That evening, as the sun set over Blackwell Hall, Alexander took Isabella's hand and led her to the gardens. They walked together in comfortable silence until they reached a small gazebo overlooking a pond where swans glided gracefully across the water. "I have something for you," Alexander said. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a ring set with a brilliant sapphire surrounded by diamonds. "This was my mother's. She would have wanted you to have it." Isabella's eyes filled with tears as he slipped the ring onto her finger beside her wedding band. "It is beautiful, so I will treasure it always." "Not as much as I treasure you," he said, pulling her close. "You have given me something I never thought I would have. A home filled with love instead of duty. A partner instead of just a wife. A reason to smile." "You have given me far more," Isabella replied. "You showed me what real love looks like. You taught me that true romance is found in loyalty and sacrifice, not empty words. You saved me in every way a person can be saved." He kissed her deeply as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. "Come," Alexander said, offering his arm. "Let us go home." And as they walked back toward Blackwell Hall, hand in hand, Isabella reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She had been kidnapped on her wedding day, abandoned by the man she thought she would marry, held captive in darkness and fear. But from that darkness had come the greatest light. She had found her true love in the man she had once foolishly rejected. She had discovered that real strength comes not from pretty words, but from steadfast action. She had learned that sometimes the best things in life come from the worst circumstances. Years later, when their children asked how their parents fell in love, Alexander would smile and say, "Your mother taught me that patience is a virtue. I waited for her to see what was in her heart." And Isabella would add, "And your father taught me that true love is worth waiting for, even when you are too blind to see it at first." Their marriage became legendary throughout the kingdom. A love story that proved sometimes the greatest romances begin with rejection and are forged in the fires of adversity. They lived long and happy lives filled with children and grandchildren who all knew the story of how their grandmother was kidnapped on her wedding day and rescued by the Duke who never stopped loving her. And every year on their anniversary, Alexander would take Isabella's hand and say, "I would ride through 1,000 forests to find you again," to which she would always reply, "And I would wait in 1,000 dark cellars knowing you would come for me." Because that is what true love does. It rescues, it endures, it never gives up, and it always finds its way home.